At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe looked peaceful on the surface, but beneath that calm exterior, the continent was sitting on a massive invisible fault line. Empires ruled most of the known world. Borders were drawn by force rather than consent, and powerful nations believed war was not something to be avoided, but something that proved strength. By 1914, Europe was dominated by four major empires. The British Empire controlled territories across Asia, Africa, and the oceans. The French Empire was rebuilding its pride after earlier humiliations. The German Empire, newly unified and industrially powerful, was rising faster than anyone expected. And in the East, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires ruled over dozens of ethnic groups that did not see themselves as one people. This imbalance created fear. Every empire watched the others closely, constantly calculating who was growing stronger and who was falling behind. Military power became the language of diplomacy. If a nation wanted to be respected, it had to prove it could fight. Germany, unified only in 1871, was the youngest of these great powers, but also the most ambitious. Its factories were producing steel, weapons, and ships at astonishing speed. Its population was growing rapidly, and its leaders believed Germany deserved an empire equal to Britain or France. But the world had already been divided. There were few colonies left to claim. This created resentment. German leaders felt boxed in, surrounded by rivals who wanted to keep Germany weak. Britain, meanwhile, saw Germany's expanding navy as a direct threat. For Britain, control of the seas meant survival. When Germany began building battleships to rival the Royal Navy, it wasn't just competition, it felt like a declaration of intent. As nations grew suspicious of one another, they began forming alliances. These alliances were meant to prevent war, but they would eventually guarantee it. Germany aligned with Austria-Hungary. France aligned with Russia. Britain tried to stay neutral, but was increasingly pulled toward France. What made this situation dangerous was not just the alliances themselves, but how rigid they were. If one country went to war, its allies were expected to follow automatically, without debate. Europe had essentially created a system where a local conflict could trigger a continental war. At the same time, nationalism was tearing at the seams of the old empires. In places like the Balkans, people no longer identified as imperial subjects. They identified as Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and Bulgarians. They wanted their own nations, their own borders, and their own futures. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was especially vulnerable. It ruled over many ethnic groups, most of whom had little loyalty to Vienna. The empire survived not because its people were united, but because it was powerful enough to suppress rebellion. But suppression only builds resentment, and resentment was growing rapidly. Nowhere was this more dangerous than in the Balkans. The region had become known as the powder keg of Europe. Empires competed for influence there. Nationalist groups plotted in secret, and violence was common. Serbia, a small but fiercely nationalist country, dreamed of uniting all Slavic peoples under one state. Austria-Hungary saw this dream as an existential threat. Meanwhile, Russia positioned itself as the protector of Slavic nations. It supported Serbia politically and militarily, not just out of cultural solidarity, but because it wanted greater influence in southeastern Europe. This placed Russia directly against Austria-Hungary and, by extension, against Germany. By the early 1900s, Europe had also undergone rapid industrialization. This changed how wars were imagined. Leaders believed future wars would be short and decisive. No one truly understood what modern weapons, machine guns, artillery, chemical gas would do on a massive scale. There was a dangerous confidence that war could be controlled. Military planning reflected this overconfidence. Germany created the Schlieffen Plan, a detailed strategy to knock France out of a future war in weeks. France planned rapid offensives to reclaim lost territory. Russia relied on sheer manpower. These plans were rigid, complex, and left little room for diplomacy once mobilization began. And that was the most dangerous part, mobilization itself. In 1914, once an army began mobilizing, it was almost impossible to stop. Mobilization was seen as a hostile act. If one nation mobilized, its rivals felt forced to do the same, even if they wanted peace. By the summer of 1914, Europe was not peaceful. It was tense, armed, and waiting. Every alliance, every rivalry, every nationalist movement had loaded the gun. All that was missing was a trigger. That trigger would come from a single city, a single assassination, and a chain of decisions made too quickly to be undone. And once it began, no one would be able to stop it. On June 28, 1914, the city of Sarajevo looked calm, almost ordinary. Streets were decorated, crowds had gathered, and officials prepared for a royal visit. But beneath the surface, tension hung heavy in the air. Bosnia was officially part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, yet many of its people did not accept imperial rule. To them, Austria-Hungary was not a protector, it was an occupier. That day, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived in Sarajevo with his wife Sophie. The visit itself was controversial. June 28th was a symbolic date for Serbian nationalists, marking a historic defeat centuries earlier that had become a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. To nationalist groups, the Archduke's presence felt like a deliberate insult. Among the crowds were young men who believed violence was the only way to change history. They were connected to a secret nationalist network that dreamed of freeing Slavic peoples from imperial rule. These men were poorly trained, nervous, and inexperienced, but they were determined. As the motorcade moved through the city, the first attempt on the Archduke's life failed. A bomb was thrown, but it bounced off the car and exploded behind it, injuring several people. Panic spread, but Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing with the visit. It was a decision that would prove fatal. Later that day, the motorcade took a wrong turn. By pure coincidence, the car stopped near a cafe where one of the conspirators, Gavrilo Princip, stood in shock. He had already assumed the plan had failed. Now, suddenly, the Archduke was only a few feet away. Princip did not hesitate. He stepped forward and fired 2 shots. One struck Franz Ferdinand. The other hit Sophie. Within minutes, both were dead. In isolation, this was a political assassination tragic, but not unprecedented. European history was filled with assassinations. On its own, it should not have caused a global war, But Europe in 1914 was not stable enough to absorb a shock like this. Austria-Hungary was furious. Leaders in Vienna believed Serbia was behind the attack, whether directly or indirectly. They feared that if Serbia was not punished, nationalist movements would spread and tear their empire apart. But Austria-Hungary hesitated. Serbia was small, but it was backed by Russia. Before taking action, Austria-Hungary turned to its most powerful ally, Germany. Germany gave what would later be known as the blank check, a promise of full support, no matter what Austria-Hungary decided to do. This encouragement removed any remaining restraint. 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum to Serbia. The demands were intentionally harsh, designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted most of them, but not all. That was enough. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. This single declaration set the alliance system into motion. Russia, seeing itself as Serbia's protector and fearing a loss of influence in the Balkans, began mobilizing its massive army. To Germany, Russian mobilization was a direct threat. Germany responded by declaring war on Russia. Then, following its pre-written military plans, Germany declared war on France as well. To reach France quickly, German troops invaded Belgium, a neutral country whose neutrality Britain had promised to protect. Britain now faced a choice. Staying out of the war would preserve peace at home, but it would mean abandoning a treaty and allowing Germany to dominate Western Europe. Within days, Britain declared war on Germany. In less than a week, what had started as a regional conflict in the Balkans had become a full-scale European war. Within months, it would spread far beyond Europe. What makes this moment so haunting is how quickly diplomacy collapsed. Leaders did not fully understand the consequences of their decisions. Each move was defensive in their own minds. Each country believed it was acting to protect itself. But together these decisions created a chain reaction that no one could stop. There were no villains twirling mustaches in secret rooms. There were no grand masterminds planning a world war. Instead, there was fear, pride, miscalculation, and a system designed to turn crisis into catastrophe. By August 1914, millions of men were marching toward the front lines. Many believed they would be home by Christmas. They had no idea they were walking into one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The war had begun, but the real horror was still ahead. When World War I began in the summer of 1914, almost every major power believed the same thing: the war would be short. Soldiers marched to the front with flowers, cheering crowds, and confidence. Generals relied on decades-old strategies that assumed speed, honor, and decisive battles. None of them truly understood what modern industrial warfare was about to unleash. Germany moved first. Its entire strategy depended on speed. The German High Command knew it could not afford a long war on two fronts, France in the west and Russia in the east. So they activated a rigid plan designed years earlier, aiming to crush France quickly before turning east to face Russia. German armies surged through Belgium, ignoring its neutrality, and smashed into northern France. At first, the plan seemed to work. German forces advanced rapidly, pushing French and British troops backward. Paris itself appeared to be in danger. But near the River Marne, something unexpected happened. Exhausted German troops were stretched thin. Supply lines were breaking down, and communication failures created gaps in their advance. French and British forces launched a desperate counterattack. It was not a decisive victory, but it was enough to stop the German advance. This moment changed everything. Both sides realized that neither could easily defeat the other. Instead of retreating, armies dug in. Soldiers began carving deep trenches into the earth, stretching mile after mile across France and Belgium. What emerged was the Western front, a frozen battlefield that would barely move for years. Life in the trenches was nothing like the romantic visions of war that soldiers had imagined. Trenches were muddy, filthy, and infested with rats. Rain turned the ground into thick sludge that swallowed boots and sometimes entire bodies. Soldiers lived surrounded by the dead, often unable to retrieve fallen comrades trapped in the mud. Disease spread rapidly. Trench foot, caused by constant exposure to cold and wet conditions, rotted flesh, and sometimes required amputation. Lice were everywhere. Sleep was rare. Fear was constant. Above the trenches lay no man's land, a deadly stretch of open ground between opposing lines. Crossing it meant almost certain death. Machine guns, a relatively new weapon, could cut down hundreds of advancing soldiers in minutes. Artillery shells rained endlessly, shattering bodies and landscapes alike. Yet generals continued to order frontal assaults. The logic was simple and horrifying. Throw enough men at the enemy lines, and eventually something would break. In reality, it was usually the soldiers who broke first. Battles like the First Battle of Ypres showed how brutal this new kind of war had become. Entire units were wiped out. Young men, some barely trained, were sent into storms of bullets and shells with little chance of survival. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war looked different, but was no less deadly. Russia mobilized huge armies quickly, but poor infrastructure, weak leadership, and supply shortages crippled its efforts. German forces defeated Russian armies in massive battles, inflicting catastrophic losses. Despite these victories, Germany still could not end the war quickly. The Western Front remained locked in place. By the end of 1914, it was clear that the war was not going to end soon. The dream of a swift victory had died in the trenches. What replaced it was a grinding war of attrition, a slow contest of endurance, where victory would go to the side that could suffer longer. For soldiers, this realization was devastating. Many had enlisted believing they were part of a glorious adventure. Now they understood they were trapped in a machine designed to consume human lives. Letters from the front began to change in tone. Early excitement faded into despair, exhaustion, and numbness. Soldiers spoke of constant shelling that never stopped, of watching friends die inches away, of feeling less than human. And still the war spread. The Ottoman Empire joined the conflict, opening new fronts in the Middle East. Fighting erupted in Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus. Colonial troops from Africa, India, and Southeast Asia were drawn into a European war they barely understood. World War I was no longer just a European conflict. It was becoming a global one. By the time winter arrived, millions were already dead or wounded. The front lines had barely moved. The world had entered a new era of warfare, one defined not by glory, but by mass destruction, and the worst was still yet to come. By 1915, it was painfully clear that traditional tactics could not break the stalemate on the battlefield. Trench warfare had locked millions of soldiers in place, and every major power faced the same problem: how to force a breakthrough without sacrificing entire generations. The solution they turned to would forever change the nature of war. The answer was technology. Industrial nations began using their factories not to improve life, but to perfect killing. World War I became the first truly mechanized war, where machines, not soldiers, decided the scale of destruction. One of the most terrifying innovations was chemical warfare. In April 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, German forces released clouds of chlorine gas toward Allied trenches. Soldiers watched in horror as a greenish-yellow fog drifted across no man's land. Those who inhaled it felt their lungs burn and fill with fluid. Many drowned on dry land, clawing at their throats in panic. Gas warfare introduced fear unlike anything soldiers had experienced before. Unlike bullets or shells, gas was invisible, unpredictable, and suffocating. Wind could change direction, turning a weapon against the army that deployed it. Soon, all sides were using gas chlorine, phosgene, and eventually mustard gas, which burned skin, blinded eyes, and caused agonizing deaths days after exposure. Gas masks became as essential as rifles. Even then, they often failed. At sea, a different kind of terror emerged. Germany, unable to defeat Britain's powerful navy in open battle, turned to submarines, U-boats. These underwater vessels could strike without warning, sinking enemy ships and vanishing beneath the waves. Merchant vessels carrying food, fuel, and supplies became targets. The goal was simple: starve Britain into surrender. But submarine warfare had consequences beyond strategy. In 1915, a German U-boat sank the British passenger liner Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 people, including civilians and Americans. The attack shocked the world. It blurred the line between military and civilian targets and fueled international outrage. The war was no longer confined to soldiers on battlefields. Civilians were becoming victims too. On land, another innovation rolled onto the battlefield: the tank. First used by the British in 1916, tanks were designed to solve the trench problem. They could cross barbed wire, withstand machine gun fire, and move over rough terrain. Early tanks were slow, unreliable, and terrifying to both enemies and the men inside them. Many broke down before reaching the front, but their psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, soldiers faced armored machines advancing through smoke and fire. Tanks did not end trench warfare immediately, but they signaled the future of warfare, one dominated by machines rather than men. Meanwhile, war in the air evolved rapidly. At first, airplanes were used for reconnaissance. Pilots waved at each other as they passed in the sky. That innocence vanished quickly. Aircraft were armed with machine guns, leading to dogfights above the trenches. Fighter aces became national heroes, even as air raids began targeting cities far from the front. Bombing raids introduced a terrifying new reality: Civilians were no longer safe anywhere. As the fighting expanded, entire societies were reorganized around the war effort. This was the birth of total war. Factories shifted to producing weapons and ammunition. Governments controlled economies, rationed food, and directed labor. Women entered factories in massive numbers, replacing men who had gone to fight. Propaganda flooded newspapers, posters, and schools, portraying the enemy as monsters and the war as a noble cause. Dissent was suppressed. Questioning the war was seen as betrayal. Yet despite all this effort, victory remained elusive. Every technological breakthrough led to an equally deadly countermeasure. Gas masks reduced the effectiveness of chemical weapons. Anti-tank tactics evolved. Convoys weakened submarine campaigns. The war became a brutal cycle of innovation and response, each escalation raising the death toll. By 1916, battles like Verdun and the Somme would push this logic to its extreme. Months of fighting for mere miles of land, at the cost of millions of lives. World War I had become a war without mercy, without limits and without a clear end in sight. And as the killing continued, cracks began to form within the empires themselves. In the next part, we will see how exhaustion, revolution, and new global players began to reshape the war, and why the balance of power started to shift. By 1916, World War I had reached a level of destruction that no one had imagined when it began. Entire landscapes had been reduced to mud, wire, and shattered bodies. Millions were dead, yet no decisive victory had been achieved. The war was no longer just a contest between armies. It was a test of endurance between nations. Two battles came to symbolize this grim reality: Verdun and the Somme. Verdun was not chosen for its strategic value, but for its symbolism. The German High Command believed that if they attacked a position, the French could not afford to lose. France would bleed itself dry trying to defend it. Beginning in February 1916, artillery fire rained down on Verdun with unprecedented intensity. Shells fell day and night for months, turning forests into wastelands. The French refused to retreat. Soldiers rotated in and out of the front lines through a single supply route that became known as the Sacred Way. The battle became a matter of national pride rather than military logic. When it finally ended after nearly a year, over 700,000 men were dead or wounded, and the front line had barely moved. The Somme followed a similar pattern. Launched by the British in July 1916, the Somme offensive was meant to relieve pressure on Verdun and break through German defenses. On the very first day, the British Army suffered the worst. Losses in its history: tens of thousands of men killed or wounded within hours. Soldiers advanced across open ground, believing artillery had destroyed enemy defenses, only to be cut down by machine gun fire. By the time the battle ended months later, more than 1 million casualties had been recorded. The front had shifted only a few miles. These battles proved a devastating truth. Industrial warfare favored defense over attack. Courage and sacrifice alone could not overcome machine guns, artillery, and trenches. As Western Europe bled, the strain began tearing empires apart from the inside. Nowhere was this more dramatic than in Russia. Russia had entered the war unprepared. Its industry was weak, its railways insufficient, and its army poorly equipped. Soldiers were sent into battle without rifles, told to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. Food shortages and military defeats shattered public confidence in the government. By 1917, the situation collapsed. Widespread protests erupted over food shortages and inflation. The Russian army began to mutiny. Tsar Nicholas II, unable to control the crisis, abdicated the throne. The centuries-old Russian monarchy fell almost overnight. But the revolution did not stop there. Later that year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power with a promise of peace, land, and bread. For them, the war was an imperialist disaster that had to end immediately. Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918, withdrawing from the war and surrendering vast territories to Germany. For Germany, this seemed like a turning point. With Russia out, German troops were freed from the Eastern Front and moved west. In early 1918, Germany launched massive offensives in a final attempt to win before their enemies could fully recover. At first, these attacks succeeded. German forces advanced deeper into Allied territory than they had since 1914. Paris once again appeared threatened, but Germany had one critical problem: exhaustion. Years of blockade had crippled its economy. Civilians were starving. Soldiers were tired, undersupplied, and increasingly demoralized. Meanwhile, a new force was beginning to arrive in Europe, one that would change the balance of the war. The United States, though officially neutral at first, American involvement had been growing for years. German submarine attacks on shipping, combined with the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, an attempt to encourage Mexico to attack the use pushed America into the war. In 1917, American troops did not immediately dominate the battlefield, but their presence mattered. They brought fresh manpower, vast industrial resources, and renewed morale to the Allied cause. Unlike European armies, they were not yet exhausted by years of trench warfare. As German offensives stalled in mid-1918, the Allies began to push back. The balance had shifted. Germany could no longer replace its losses. Its allies were weakening. At home, public unrest was growing. The war that once promised glory now threatened total collapse. In the next and final part, we will see how this relentless pressure led to the end of the war, and how the peace that followed planted the seeds for an even greater catastrophe. By late 1918, the war that had consumed the world for more than 4 years was finally approaching its end, but not because one side had achieved a clean, decisive victory. Instead, World War I ended because the systems holding entire empires together began to collapse under their own weight. Germany was the first to break. On the battlefield, German forces were being pushed back on all fronts. The Allied counteroffensive, supported by fresh American troops, relentless artillery, tanks, and coordinated assaults, steadily forced German armies into retreat. This period became known as the 100 Days Offensive, and unlike earlier battles, it did not stall into static trench warfare. German defenses, weakened by exhaustion and lack of supplies, simply could not hold. But the real collapse was happening far from the front lines. At home, Germany was starving. The British naval blockade had strangled imports of food and raw materials for years. Civilians survived on rationed diets that barely sustained life. Workers went on strike. Soldiers returning from the front spread stories of hopelessness and defeat. Trust in the government evaporated. In October 1918, German sailors ordered to launch a final, suicidal naval attack mutinied. That rebellion quickly spread to cities across the country. Workers' councils formed. Demonstrations erupted. The political order unraveled in a matter of weeks. Facing revolution, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne and fled into exile. Germany, once the proud heart of a powerful empire, suddenly became a republic struggling to maintain order. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice was signed. The guns fell silent. The fighting stopped, but peace had not yet begun. The war had killed more than 16 million people and wounded countless others. Entire regions of Europe were physically destroyed. Economies were shattered. A generation had been traumatized by industrialized violence on an unprecedented scale. Now came the task of deciding what the world would look like after the war. In 1919, leaders from the victorious Allied powers gathered in Paris to shape the peace. Among them were France, Britain, and the United States, each with very different goals. France wanted security above all else. Having been invaded twice by Germany in less than 50 years, French leaders were determined to ensure Germany could never threaten them again. They demanded harsh punishment, territorial losses, and military restrictions. Britain sought balance. It wanted to weaken Germany, but not destroy it entirely. A stable Europe was good for trade, and British leaders feared that crushing Germany too completely would create chaos. The United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson, arrived with a vision rather than revenge. Wilson proposed the 14 points, a plan based on self-determination, open diplomacy, reduced armaments, and the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. These visions clashed. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war through the infamous War Guilt Clause. It lost significant territory, including Alsace-Lorraine. Its military was drastically reduced. It was forbidden from maintaining an air force or a strong navy. Most devastating of all, Germany was required to pay massive reparations, sums so large they crippled the economy. To many Germans, the treaty felt less like peace and more like humiliation. Meanwhile, other empires collapsed completely. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved into multiple new nations, many with unstable borders and ethnic tensions. The Ottoman Empire was carved apart by European powers, reshaping the Middle East in ways that ignored local realities and sowed long-term conflict. Russia, having left the war early, descended into a brutal civil war that eventually produced the Soviet Union. World War I had not ended conflict, it had rearranged it. The League of Nations was established in the hope of preventing future wars, but it lacked real enforcement power. Ironically, the United States, whose president had championed it, never joined. Across Europe, the consequences of the war lingered. Veterans returned home physically and mentally broken. Economies struggled under debt and reconstruction. Political extremism flourished as people searched for meaning in the ruins. Most importantly, the peace settlement failed to address the deeper causes of the war: nationalism, rivalry, inequality, and unresolved grievances. Instead of healing wounds, it preserved resentment. Within just 2 decades, those unresolved tensions would erupt again, this time in a war even more destructive than the first. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it became the opening chapter of a far darker century, proving that ending a war is far easier than creating a lasting peace. When the fighting stopped in November 1918, many people believed the nightmare was finally over. Soldiers went home, flags were raised, and speeches were made promising that such destruction would never happen again. But the end of World War I did not bring true closure. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long, unstable aftermath that reshaped the modern world in ways few fully understood at the time. The physical destruction was obvious. Vast areas of France and Belgium were left uninhabitable, their fields poisoned by shells and their towns reduced to rubble. Railways, factories, and farms across Europe lay in ruins. Rebuilding would take years, and for many nations, decades. The human cost was even deeper. Millions of soldiers returned home carrying wounds that were not visible. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was widespread. Though poorly understood, entire communities had lost a generation of young men. Families were broken, and societies struggled to reintegrate veterans who had spent years living in constant fear and violence. Economically, the war had shattered stability. European nations were drowning in debt. Inflation soared, particularly in Germany, where the burden of reparations led to economic collapse. Money lost its value almost overnight. Savings disappeared. Middle-class families were pushed into poverty, creating anger and desperation that radical political movements would later exploit. Politically, the map of the world had been redrawn, but not carefully. New nations were created in Central and Eastern Europe, often with borders that ignored ethnic, religious, and cultural realities. Minorities found themselves trapped inside states that did not represent them. Old rivalries were frozen rather than resolved, waiting for the right moment to explode again. In the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire led to artificial borders drawn by European powers. Promises made during the war were broken, and local populations were left under foreign mandates instead of gaining true independence. These decisions planted seeds of conflict that continue to shape the region even today. World War I also changed how wars would be fought forever. Technology had transformed conflict into something industrial and impersonal. Machine guns, poison gas, tanks, submarines, and aircraft had shown that modern warfare could kill on a scale never before imagined. Future wars would no longer be decided by bravery alone, but by factories, supply chains, and total national mobilization. Perhaps the most profound change was psychological. Before 1914, many people believed in progress, reason, and the idea that civilization was steadily improving. World War I shattered that illusion. The war revealed how fragile modern society really was, and how quickly it could descend into chaos. This loss of faith affected art, literature, politics, and philosophy for generations. Writers, poets, and thinkers struggled to explain how a world that considered itself advanced could destroy itself so completely. And yet the most important legacy of World War I was what came next. The unresolved anger in Germany, the fear in France, the weakness of international institutions, and the rise of extremist ideologies created a dangerous combination. The peace had ended the fighting, but it had not ended the conflict. Within just 20 years, the world would be at war again. This time, the conflict would be even larger, even deadlier, and even more destructive. World War II did not come out of nowhere. It grew directly from the unfinished business of World War I. In the end, World War I was not just a war between nations. It was a turning point in human history. It marked the collapse of old empires, the birth of a new world order, and the beginning of a century defined by global conflict. Understanding World War I is not just about understanding the past. It is about understanding how easily civilization can unravel, and how important it is to learn from history before it repeats itself.